I'm Jeremy, and today we're going to be replacing the rear brakes on a 2010 Nissan Altima. If you're looking for brakes for your car, you're going to want to look for the TRQ brand because they're direct fit, rigorously tested, and they're safe for you and your family. So, let's get started. We're going to start by loosening the lug nuts while the wheel is on the ground because once it's up in the air, it's going to want to spin when we put some pressure on it. You can use a regular ratchet to pull these off, but we happen to have an air gun, so we're going to make it a little faster with the air gun. Now we'll pull the wheel off. All right, we're going to start by removing the caliper from the caliper bracket, and we're going to use a 14mm wrench. You can see this caliper has been recently replaced. It's nice and shiny. Normally they're a little rustier than this. Okay, so now we're going to pull out the top bolt, and with the bottom bolt loose, you unfortunately can't pull the bolt out, which is a little crazy to me. But what you can do is you can roll the caliper down and get it out of your way, so then you can access the pads. But before we do anything with the pads, we want to take this whole caliper bracket off because we need to get the rotor off. All right, so now we're going to be taking out these two caliper bracket bolts, and they happen to be 19mm. So we're going to use a socket and a ratchet to do so, if I'm strong enough to do it. So we've now pulled the caliper bracket bolts out, and now we can remove the entire caliper and its bracket. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hang these from something so that they don't fall and hang on the hose itself, because you can damage your brake hose if the caliper hangs from it. All right, so in this case we have a small bungee cord. We're just going to wrap it around and hang the caliper bracket from the bungee cord, like so. All right, so now it's out of the way and it's safe. All right, you can see that we have a brand new rotor on here, and it slides off really easily. But that doesn't happen in real life. Normally, this is a nice old rotor and it's very rusty, and it's stuck on there because the parking brake shoes are stuck against this hat. So I'm going to show you how to fix that problem. First thing you want to do is pull this rubber plug out. With the rubber plug out, you want this straight up and down. You don't want it over to the side or over to this side or at the bottom. You want it straight up and down. And then you can stick your screwdriver in, your flat tip screwdriver, and inside here is a wheel with teeth on it. So I'll show you how it works. So in here, this is the adjuster. And this adjuster pushes the parking brake shoes out, or it brings them in, depending on where the adjuster is. So what you want to do is stick the flat tip screwdriver in and spin this thing upward, like so. And by doing that, it will bring the parking brake shoes all the way in, and you'll be able to get your rotor off. So this is how it works. You go like this, you can look in the hole and see where the gear is, and then you can go like this, and you can spin the teeth, and that loosens up the parking brake shoes and will allow you to pull off your old rusty rotor. So normally what happens with these is over time, this adjuster gets stuck. It gets all rusty and full of water, and it will get stuck. So it will require some force with the screwdriver to get it to bring the parking brake shoes in. So what you want to do is whenever you have the rotor off, you want to take this out and you want to clean it up, re-grease it, put some anti-seize on it like this one has, and make sure it moves nice and easily. That way you can adjust your parking brake properly and the whole thing will work a lot better. So I'm going to show you how to take this thing off. You start with a needle nose pair of pliers, and right here is a little spring. And if you grab it with the needle nose pliers, you should be able to pull it right off. Well, that's the idea. That's the idea at least. Yeah, like that. Now once that spring is off, you'll be able to push away the parking brake shoe just enough to slide this thing out. Like that. And this thing is a couple different pieces. So this end comes out, so you want to put grease in that end, and then this thing threads just like a bolt does. And this is the part that gets all seized up and rusty. So what you want to do is unscrew this completely and clean the whole thing out really good. Maybe wire brush it, and then put it back together with some anti-seize on it, and that'll prevent it from seizing up the next time. Once you've done that, then you can take it and reinstall it the same way that you took it out. So once it's all nice and clean, all greased, anti-seize, you put it right back in where it belongs. Sort of like that. Push those together, and then you can take your spring and put it right back on. Like this. Come on. There we go. So now the adjuster is back in place, and it'll spin so that you can adjust your parking brake properly, and it'll work in the future. All right, so you have your new brake rotor, and you put it on like so. And it goes on nice and smooth, but what happens is, right now your parking brake shoes are completely bottomed out because you just rebuilt your adjuster. So what you want to do is you want to adjust this out until you can just barely feel the parking brake shoes on the rotor, and then you'll back it off just a hair. So let's do that. You'll start with your flat tip screwdriver, and you'll push down on this several times until your parking brake shoes come out a bit. We'll do like that much, and then we'll test fit it. And that's a little too much. All right, so now we'll back it off a little bit by going right in here. Better. You can still hear it rubbing, so let's go a little bit more. All right, that's very, very light rubbing. And I bet if I was to actually tighten this down, it wouldn't rub. Yeah, it doesn't rub in certain areas, so we're real close. And if you pull it off, you can see it's about that far out. It's going to be different on yours depending on how much brake shoe is left, but that's pretty much how this works. So let's put the rotor on. Don't forget to put the rubber plug back in here. You never want to lose these things because they do prevent like dust and water and stuff from getting in there. Once that cap is in, you're able to put your caliper bracket back on, and then we'll start working on the brake shoes. Pull the bungee out. I'll set these brake pads aside too so they don't fall. All right, so we'll slide this bracket right back into place. All right, let's get this bolt in there. Before you tighten these, or before you put these bolts in, you may want to put some anti-seize on them and clean them up really well because they tend to get really rusty. This one, again, the caliper bracket has been replaced along with the caliper, so I'm working with a lot of new parts here, which is sort of cheating. In reality, these things are usually pretty rusty and the bolts are rusty as well. So clean the bolts really well, put some anti-seize on there, and then put the bolts back in. With the two bolts in, you're going to want to torque those to 62 foot-pounds. Assuming you can get a torque wrench in there, which it looks like we can. So the torque wrench wouldn't fit on the bottom bolt, but we were able to torque the top one to 62 foot-pounds. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to tighten up the bottom one as close as I can to the top one. I've been doing this for a long time, so I have a pretty good feel of what the right torque is. So I'm just going to test one versus the other. And that feels like about 62 foot-pounds to me, I'm not gonna lie. There we go. Now it's nice and tight. So when you're installing the brake pads, you wanna make sure that the sliding area for the pads is nice and clean. That often means taking these things off and cleaning these really well. And sometimes you need to wire brush the caliper itself, depending on if there's any rust there. And you can also spray down the caliper bracket with brake clean. Once everything is nice and clean and rust-free, then you can put a little bit of grease on these sliders so that they slide really well. These were just done, so we're not going to add any more grease to this. It's plenty lubed. So now we're just going to slide the brake pads on, just like that. And the brake pads should be able to slide back and forth nice and easily within the caliper bracket. If they don't, then you may still have some rust buildup inside the caliper bracket that you'll need to clean out. All right, so now we need to compress this piston back into the caliper. And there's a couple different ways of doing this. You can buy a tool that is specifically meant to compress caliper pistons. You can also use a big pair of pliers, in this case, channel locks. And this is what I'm going to use today because it's nice and easy and it happens to be in my hand. So now the piston is all the way compressed and you can swing the caliper right up and into the caliper bracket. All right, so now we're going to tighten up these two caliper bolts, the 14mm ones. We're going to tighten these up and we're going to torque them to 32 foot-pounds. I like to start them off with a wrench first, and then we'll switch to a torque wrench. So now I have the torque wrench on there, on the upper bolt. We're going to go to 32 foot-pounds. Unfortunately, much like the other caliper bracket, you can't fit a torque wrench in here. So what we're going to do is the same thing as the caliper bracket. I'm going to kind of get a feel for it on the top one, and then I'm going to tighten the bottom one the same. After any sort of brake work, you always want to get into the car and pump the brake pedal a few times. And what that does is it pushes the piston in the caliper out all the way, because right now there's a whole lot of play within this caliper. So you want to take out that play, because if you don't, when you first go to move the car, you're going to have no brake pedal. Your pedal is going to go to the floor and it's going to get real scary real fast. So always get inside before you start the car or do anything, pump the brakes a few times and build up some pressure. The other thing that you want to do, you'll notice I got greasy fingerprints all over this rotor. And you don't want that because your rotor is obviously stopping your car. You don't want grease all over it. So one thing that I always do at the end of a brake job is I'll go with brake clean and I'll make sure I get all the greasy fingerprints off. You want to do this to the front and the back of the rotor. Usually the back of the rotor you can spray from the bottom, and you can make sure that you get all the grease off. And that way you know there's no grease getting into your brake pads when you go to stop the car. With the car nice and low to the ground, we're going to slide the wheel on. And make sure that the notch in the hubcap lines up with the valve on the tire. And then hand tighten all of these before you go cranking them down with any sort of tools. That way you don't cross thread any of the lug nuts. Okay, so now we're going to torque these wheels to 83 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a star pattern.